There's an old, forgotten village buried deep in the countryside called Ravendale. If you try looking it up, you won't find much, just scattered mentions in old records and some folklore passed down by the locals. But if you ever stop in one of the small towns nearby and ask the right people, they'll tell you to stay far away. Not from the village itself, because that place doesn't even exist anymore, but from the old forest path that leads there. The villagers abandoned Ravendale decades ago, but the path remained. And for reasons no one fully understands, people who take that route don't come back. Some who barely escaped spoke of strange whispers following them through the trees, shadowy figures moving just beyond sight, and an invisible force pulling them deeper into the woods, as if the forest itself was alive and hungry. This is the story of a group of hikers who ignored the warnings and what they found lurking in the cursed woods. Only one of them made it out. Last October, 4 friends, Mark, Sarah, Ethan, and Jake, set out on a week-long road trip. They were all outdoor enthusiasts, the kind of people who thrived on camping in remote locations and pushing their limits. It was supposed to be a fun getaway before winter set in. On the 3rd day of their trip, they stopped at a small gas station near the edge of an unmarked forest. While paying for snacks, Mark struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed immediately wary of them. "You're not heading toward Ravendale, are you?" the old man asked. The group exchanged confused glances. They had never even heard of the place. "Just a shortcut through the woods," Ethan shrugged. "We found an old trail on our GPS that cuts through this area. Saves us almost 2 hours." The attendant's expression darkened. "That's not a shortcut. That's the cursed path. People go missing out there." Sarah laughed nervously. "Come on, are you serious?" "I've lived here my whole life. I'm dead serious." His voice was firm. "Turn around. Take the long way." They dismissed the warning, assuming it was just another backwoods legend meant to scare outsiders. The thought of being scared of a trail felt ridiculous. Big mistake. As soon as they stepped onto the forest path, something felt off. The air was thick, humid, and unnaturally still. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. Even their footsteps sounded muffled, swallowed up by the dense canopy above. About 20 minutes in, Mark suddenly stopped. "Did you guys hear that?" They all listened. Faintly, from somewhere deeper in the woods came a whisper, too low to make out words, but unmistakably human. Jake forced a laugh. "Wind in the trees, man. Relax." Sarah, however, wasn't so sure. She had been noticing shadows moving between the trees, but every time she turned to look directly at them, they weren't there. Then their GPS glitched. The map showed them looping in a circle, even though they had been walking in a straight line. Mark muttered, "That's weird." And then Ethan was gone. One moment he was right behind them, the next he had disappeared. "Ethan," Sarah called. No answer. They retraced their steps but found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had walked off the trail. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. A distant scream echoed through the trees. It was Ethan's voice, but it sounded distorted, stretched into something unnatural. Panic set in. "We need to get the hell out of here," Mark said. They started walking faster, but the path seemed different. What had once been a dirt trail was now overgrown, as if no one had walked here in decades. That night they had no choice but to set up camp. They built a fire and tried to stay calm, but the unease was unbearable. At some point, Sarah whispered, "I feel like we're being watched." Mark gripped his flashlight. "We probably are." A snapping twig, a rustling sound just beyond the firelight. And then Sarah screamed. She was yanked backward into the darkness so fast it didn't even seem real. One second she was sitting there, the next she was gone. Jake and Mark sprinted in the direction she had been dragged, but there was nothing. No footprints, no struggle, just silence. Then from the darkness they heard her voice. "Only..." It wasn't right. "Mark, Jake, over here." The way she spoke was wrong, like her voice was being mimicked by something that didn't quite understand how humans talk. Jake grabbed Mark's arm. "That's not Sarah." The trees began to shift. The shadows stretched, moving in ways that didn't make sense. And that's when they saw it. A tall, faceless figure, barely visible in the flickering firelight. It had long, spindly fingers that twitched unnaturally as it crept toward them. "Written." Jake didn't make it. Mark ran blindly through the woods until he stumbled onto something unexpected. An old, rotting cabin. Inside he found photographs, dozens of them. All of them were hikers, their faces twisted in terror. The dates on the back spanned over a century. A dusty journal lay on the table. The final entry read, "The village's curse can't be undone. The forest is its prison, and now it is ours. If you find this, burn the effigy. It's the only way." Mark looked around frantically, and then he saw it. A small wooden effigy covered in strange carvings. The whispers grew louder. The shadows closed in. With shaking hands, he set the effigy on fire. The forest screamed. Mark woke up on the side of a highway. No forest, no path, no sign of his friends. A passing driver picked him up. "You okay, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at his reflection in the window. Because in the glass he could see something behind him. A shadowy figure, whispering his name. The path still exists. If you ever find yourself near an unnamed forest trail, don't go in. Some places were never meant to be walked again. There's an old farmhouse in a remote village that has stood untouched for almost a century. If you ask the locals about it, they'll tell you to stay away. They'll refuse to explain why, only warning that those who enter either disappear or return. No one dares go inside anymore, not since the last person who did was found wandering the outskirts of town, muttering to himself, refusing to speak about what he saw. And yet the house remains silent, empty, waiting. But as the villagers will tell you, just because it's silent doesn't mean it's empty. This is the story of Daniel Carter, a journalist who thought the legend was nothing more than an old wives' tale. He wanted to prove there was nothing inside that house. He wanted to debunk the myth. But he never should have stepped inside. Daniel Carter had built his career on exposing urban legends and superstitions. He ran a small but popular online column where he investigated haunted locations, only to prove that nothing paranormal existed. He'd visited abandoned hospitals, ghost towns, even so-called cursed forests, and had never once seen anything he couldn't explain. So when he heard about the silent farmhouse, he thought it would be just another easy case. He arrived in the small, isolated village just before sunset. The people were wary of him from the start. They knew why he was there, and they didn't like it. An old man at the general store warned him, "You shouldn't go there, son. That place doesn't let people leave." Daniel just smiled. "I'll be fine." The man shook his head. "No, you won't." Despite the warnings, Daniel drove toward the farmhouse, determined to prove them wrong. The farmhouse stood alone at the edge of a vast field, surrounded by trees. The sun was setting behind it, casting long shadows across the peeling paint and broken windows. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling of leaves, not even the distant sound of insects. Just silence. Inside, the house was eerily intact. The furniture was covered in dust, but still in place, as if the previous occupants had simply vanished in the middle of dinner. Plates remained on the dining table. A child's rocking horse sat in the corner of the living room. It was as if time had stopped. Daniel set up his recording equipment, speaking into his microphone. "It's just an old house," he said. "Nothing unusual, just superstition." Then the silence deepened. It was an unnatural kind of silence, one that seemed to press against his eardrums. And then, Footsteps. From upstairs. Daniel froze. His brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. Maybe the house was shifting as it settled. But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate step. And another. It wasn't the creaking of an old house. It was someone walking. Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under his weight as he ascended. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched before him. Several doors lined the walls, all slightly ajar. Something was off. Then he noticed it. One of the doors was slowly, silently closing on its own. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps. He stepped forward, pushing the door open. Inside was a small, decayed room. A tiny bed, old toys scattered across the floor, and a mirror cracked down the middle. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A diary. He picked it up, carefully flipping through the fragile pages. The handwriting was that of a child. They locked me in here. They said I was wrong, that I wasn't me anymore. I don't want to be alone. I won't be alone. Daniel suddenly felt a presence behind him. He turned, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. Just the mirror and his reflection. Except his reflection wasn't moving the same way he was. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He reached up slowly, touching his face, found the front door and tore it open. But instead of the outside world, there was only another hallway. Behind him, the whispering grew louder. I won't be alone. Then, darkness. The next morning, the villagers noticed Daniel's car still parked outside the farmhouse. They didn't go inside. They already knew what had happened. A week later, a traveler passing through saw something strange. He swore he saw a light on in the upstairs window, and in the reflection, a figure watching him. Daniel never came back, and the farmhouse remains silent. There's a small village hidden deep in the countryside where no one speaks of the graveyard at the edge of town. It's not overgrown, nor is it abandoned. It looks ordinary, too ordinary. But every year, on the same night, the villagers lock their doors, shut their windows, and refuse to step outside until morning. Because on that night, the dead whisper. It's a legend passed down for generations. People say the voices call out names, and if your name is spoken, you're never seen again. One man didn't believe the stories. He was an outsider, new to the village, and thought it was just local superstition. His name was Ethan Graves, and one night, he heard the whispers call for him. Ethan moved to the village looking for a fresh start. He was a journalist, tired of city life, and had inherited an old house from a distant relative he barely knew. The place was peaceful, quiet, almost too quiet. The villagers were kind but distant. They never truly welcomed him. They answered his questions with half-truths and vague warnings, especially about the graveyard. One night in the village pub, he asked an old man about it. The man went pale. "Stay away," he said, "and if you ever hear your name in the night, don't answer." Ethan chuckled. "What happens if I do?" The man just stared at him. "You don't want to find out?" Ethan couldn't ignore it. He was a journalist. Curiosity was in his nature. The village had no recorded history of missing persons, no proof of anything supernatural. It was just a legend. So, on the anniversary of the tragedy, he walked to the graveyard at midnight. It was dead silent. No wind, no animals, just an unnatural stillness. Then, the first whisper, soft, faint, coming from the graves. Then another, and another. The voices weren't speaking full sentences, just names, whispered over and over. Then he heard it. Ethan Graves. A shiver ran down his spine. The whispers grew louder. The air grew colder. Then he felt something behind him. He turned. Nothing. But the whispers continued, closer, surrounding him. He ran. The next day, Ethan buried himself in research. He searched old records, questioned the villagers, tried to understand what happened. And then he found it. Decades ago, the village had been different. It had been a place of betrayal and bloodshed. A group of outsiders had come to settle here, but the villagers had turned on them, accusing them of dark practices. They were murdered and buried in unmarked graves. The villagers had erased the truth. But the dead didn't forget. And every year they called out for justice, or revenge. That night, Ethan locked his doors and windows, telling himself it was just a story. But at midnight, the whispers returned. Inside his house, he grabbed his phone, turning on the recording app, his hands shaking. The whispers grew louder. Then something brushed against his ear. A voice, cold and breathy. Ethan Graves. His blood ran cold. The lights flickered. The whispers became screams. The walls shook. The shadows moved. He tried to run, but the door wouldn't open. The last thing his phone recorded was his own voice, screaming. Then, silence. The next morning, Ethan was gone. His house was empty, his belongings untouched. The only sign of him was his phone, lying on the floor. The villagers didn't ask questions, they didn't call the police, they just pretended he had never existed. Because this had happened before. A week later, a traveler passing through saw something strange. A figure standing at the edge of the graveyard, staring into the village. The traveler swore the figure looked just like Ethan, but Ethan was gone, and the graveyard was silent. Until next year, when the dead would whisper again.